Condolences.
Where is she?
Sorry?
Your wife. She was supposed to be here. Where is she?
I think she just felt, in light of the circumstances, it would be better if I helped broker the arrangements.
There is a sentence that a mother said before any of it happened. Before the plane went into the water off Martha's Vineyard. Before the 5 days of searching. Before the Navy divers found 3 bodies still strapped into their seats at the bottom of the Atlantic. Before the ashes were scattered at sea and the settlement was negotiated and the world moved on to the next chapter of the Kennedy mythology. Before all of it, a mother said a sentence. I told him never to take 2 of my girls up at the same time. She said it to John F. Girls. Kennedy Jr., the man her daughter had married, the man who was learning to fly, the man with the single-engine plane and the new pilot's license, and the specific, documented confidence of someone who had been told his entire life that the rules that applied to other people did not quite apply to him. She told him, never take 2 of my girls up at the same time. It was not a complicated request. It was the instinct of a mother who understood, in the wordless way that mothers understand these things, that you do not put everyone you love in the same fragile machine, that you do not gamble 2 daughters on one flight, that if something goes wrong, and things go wrong, you do not lose everything at once. She said it. And on the evening of July 16, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. took off from Fairfield, New Jersey, in a single-engine Piper Saratoga, with both of her daughters on board. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren Bessette. The plane crashed off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. The victims, who died on impact, were still strapped into their seats, both daughters. In the same plane, exactly the way she had told him never to do it. Her name is Ann Freeman, and she is the person at the center of this story that the world has never told, because the world was too busy telling the other story. The story of the Crown Prince of Camelot. The story of John, the little boy who saluted his father's casket, now grown and gone, in a tragedy that amplified the Kennedy mythology to a scale it had not reached since Dallas. That was the story everyone told. The story nobody told was the one about the mother in Greenwich, Connecticut, who had warned him, who had said the specific words that, in hindsight, are almost unbearable to read, and who then watched the exact thing she had feared take both of her daughters in a single night. I am Mary. And today, this channel is going to tell the story of Ann Freeman, not the footnote, not the Carolyn and Lauren's mother, not the woman who appears in the coverage of the crash for one sentence about a settlement before the cameras turn back to the Kennedys. The woman. The educator who spent her life in the New York City public schools. The mother of 3 daughters who raised them in Connecticut after a divorce. The woman who warned the most famous young man in America not to do the one thing that would destroy her family, and was not listened to. And what happened to her afterward, when the institution that had consumed her daughters in life turned its machinery toward managing their deaths. Her name is Ann Freeman, she told him. He didn't listen, and she lost both of her daughters in a single night, exactly the way she had said she feared. Before the warning, before the crash and the settlement and the silence that followed, there was a family, a mother, a father, 3 daughters, 2 of them twins, raised between New York and Connecticut, in a household shaped by a divorce and a second marriage, and the specific, ordinary love of a mother who built her life around her girls, who Ann Freeman really was, and the daughters she raised, is coming. The family she built. Before she was the forgotten mother at the edge of the Kennedy tragedy, Ann Freeman was a woman who built a life around her daughters. She was born Anne Marie Messina in 1939. She came from an Italian-American family, and she went into education, the New York City public school system, where she worked as a teacher and later an administrator. When she married, she had joined the New York public school system as an administrator. This is the first thing to understand about Ann Freeman, and it is the thing the coverage of the crash almost never mentions. She was a working woman, a professional, a person with a life and a career of her own that had nothing to do with the Kennedys, nothing to do with fame, nothing to do with the spotlight that would eventually consume her family. She was a school administrator. She spent her days in the New York City public schools, the specific, unglamorous, genuinely important work of educating children, the kind of work that does not make headlines and does not generate magazine covers, and is, by almost any honest measure, more valuable than most of the things that do. Anne Marie Messina and William Joseph Bessette married on June 29, 1963, in White Plains, New York. William Bessette was an architectural engineer. They built a family. On November 5, 1964, they welcomed twin daughters, Lauren and Lisa. Just 14 months later, their youngest daughter, Carolyn, was born on January 7, 1966. 3 daughters in just over a year. Twins first, Lauren and Lisa, born on the same November day, and then Carolyn, 14 months later, the youngest. The family remained in White Plains and lived much like any other working-class family, striving to provide the best for their children. They were a devout Roman Catholic household and raised their daughters with strong faith-based values and a close-knit sense of family. A working family. Devout Catholic. Close-knit. This is not the mythology. This is not Camelot. This is the specific, ordinary, deeply American reality of a school administrator and an architectural engineer raising 3 daughters in White Plains, New York, in the 1960s and 1970s, going to Mass, providing what they could, building the kind of close family that would produce 3 women who, by every account, remained close to each other for the rest of their 2 short lives. And then, in 1974, the marriage ended. For personal reasons, William and Anne divorced in 1974. The children remained with Anne. Carolyn was 8 years old. The twins were 10. Ann Freeman, Ann Bessette, then, became a single mother of 3 young daughters. And she did what single mothers do. She held the family together. She kept working. She kept the girls close to their father, who remained in White Plains. Despite the changes, the daughters remained close to William and visited him often. And then, in 1977, she remarried. She married orthopedic surgeon Dr. Richard Freeman in 1977 and eventually moved to Old Greenwich, Connecticut. With his 2 children and Anne's 3, they formed a blended family. Dr. Richard Freeman, an orthopedic surgeon. This is where Anne Messina became Ann Freeman, the name the world would eventually know her by, in the one sentence the world would eventually grant her. The family moved to Old Greenwich, Connecticut. The 3 stunning Bessette sisters were raised in Greenwich. All 3 sisters were close, but, as it tends to be with twins, Lauren and Lisa were inseparable. And the daughters Ann Freeman raised became remarkable women. Lauren Bessette became an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. She built a successful career on Wall Street, rising to a senior position and working internationally, including in Hong Kong. She was, by every account, brilliant and warm and devoted to public service. She had played bingo with the elderly, sung in nursing homes at Christmas, tutored kids who needed help. Lisa Bessette, Lauren's twin, became an academic. She earned a PhD in art history and lived a far more private life. And Carolyn, the youngest, became a publicist at Calvin Klein, rose through the company on the strength of her own instincts, and became one of the most photographed women in America when she married John F. Kennedy Jr., 3 daughters, a school administrator's daughters, an investment banker, a scholar, a fashion icon, all of them close, all of them raised in the same close-knit, faith-based, ordinary, extraordinary family that Ann Freeman had held together through a divorce and a remarriage and the specific, daily work of being a mother. And Ann Freeman had every reason, in the 1990s, to believe that the hardest parts were behind her. The girls were grown. They were thriving. The youngest had married into the most famous family in America. She had built something. She had no idea that within a few years, two of the three would be gone, in a single night, in a single plane, exactly the way she would warn the man flying it not to do. When Carolyn Bessette began dating John F. Kennedy Jr., when the youngest of Ann Freeman's daughters was pulled into the most intense spotlight in American celebrity, Anne saw things that the public did not. She saw what the attention was doing to her daughter. She saw the marriage that was struggling, and at the wedding itself she said something, a toast, that people who were there have never forgotten. What Ann Freeman saw coming, and the warning she gave that nobody wanted to hear, is coming. What a mother saw coming. In September 1996, Carolyn Bessette married John F. Kennedy Jr. It was an intimate ceremony on Cumberland Island, Georgia, on September 21, 1996. Carolyn's own relatives, including older sisters Lisa and Lauren Bessette, and parents Ann Messina Freeman and William Bessette, were among the 35 guests. It was, by every account, a beautiful wedding, secret, small, romantic in the specific, old-fashioned way that two private people who genuinely loved each other could still, in 1996, almost pull off without the world watching. But at the rehearsal dinner the night before, in front of the small group of family and close friends, something happened that the people who were there have never forgotten. Ann Freeman gave a toast, and it was not the toast anyone expected. John's close friend Robert Littell, who was present at the wedding, wrote in his memoir, "The Men We Became." It was boisterous and light-hearted, for the most part, except for a toast made by Carolyn's mother, Ann Freeman. I don't remember her exact words, but she implied that she was worried for her daughter, unsure if this union was in her best interest. A mother stood up at her daughter's wedding rehearsal dinner, and instead of the warm, celebratory words that the occasion called for, she said, in front of everyone, that she was worried, that she was not sure this was right for Carolyn. Littell described how the crowd, happy and enthusiastic about the union, moved on quickly from the moment, but that John was visibly stung by his mother-in-law's remarks. In hindsight, Littell wrote, "It's chilling. Chilling. That is the word John's own friend used, looking back. Because Ann Freeman was not being difficult. She was not being cold. She was not failing to appreciate the extraordinary man her daughter was marrying. She was seeing something. As one biographer explained it, Carolyn had always been a private individual. Marrying a public figure would be tantamount to being thrust under a microscope. Every aspect of her personal life would be explored and exploited by the media. That is what Ann Freeman saw. She saw her private, sensitive, fiercely guarded youngest daughter about to be pulled into the most intense spotlight in American celebrity, the specific, consuming machinery of Kennedy fame that had already destroyed or damaged so many of the people who had entered its orbit. And she was afraid for her. She was right to be afraid, because everything Ann Freeman feared at that rehearsal dinner came true. Carolyn became increasingly isolated in their Tribeca loft, exhausted by the paparazzi and demoralized by tabloid headlines speculating that she was depressed, a drug addict, pregnant, you name it. The microscope. Exactly as Anne had feared. The paparazzi camped outside the loft. The tabloid headlines invented a new crisis every week, the specific, relentless erosion of a private person's life by a public that had decided it owned her. When Princess Diana was killed in a car crash in August 1997, chased by paparazzi, Carolyn was horrified. She posed for every photo, she did everything right, Carolyn said, and they still killed her. Carolyn saw herself in Diana. A private woman, hunted by the same machine, doing everything right and still being destroyed by it. And her mother, Ann Freeman, the school administrator from White Plains, the woman who had raised 3 daughters and warned the most famous young man in America that she was worried, watched it happen from Greenwich. She had seen it coming, and she could do nothing to stop it. There is one more documented detail about Ann Freeman and her daughter's relationship with John, and it tells you everything about the kind of mother she was. After an earlier breakup between Carolyn and John, Ann had told her daughter to get on with your life. Get on with your life. That is what a mother says to a daughter she is trying to protect. Not, he's a Kennedy, hold on to him. Not think of what you'd be giving up. But get on with your life. Move forward. Don't wait. Don't tie yourself to something that is hurting you. Ann Freeman was not impressed by the Kennedy name. She was not seduced by Camelot. She was a mother, looking at her daughter, seeing the cost, and trying, in every way a mother can, to protect her child from a machine she understood was bigger and more dangerous than her daughter could handle. By the summer of 1999, the marriage was struggling. John and Carolyn had a bad week. John's executive assistant, Rosemarie Terenzio, later said. They were screaming at each other and not being heard. The paparazzi, the pressure, the specific erosion that Anne had feared at the rehearsal dinner, all of it had taken its toll. And it was into this struggling marriage, this fragile, pressured, microscope-examined union, that the question of a single-engine plane entered. A plane that John F. Kennedy Jr. would pilot himself. A plane that Ann Freeman, the mother who had already been right about everything, would warn him about. John F. Kennedy Jr. had gotten his pilot's license just over a year before. He had less than the experience that safety demanded, no instrument rating for flying in low visibility, and on the night of July 16, 1999, a broken ankle that had only recently come out of a cast. And Ann Freeman, the mother who had warned him at the wedding, who had been right about everything, gave him one more warning. The specific words, and the night her worst fear became real, is coming. The night she feared. John F. Kennedy Jr. was not an experienced pilot. This is the central, documented fact that hangs over everything that happened on the night of July 16, 1999. And it is the fact that Ann Freeman, watching from Greenwich, understood with the specific clarity of a mother who pays attention. Kennedy began to pursue his interest in flying in December 1997 and received his private pilot's license in April 1998. He had been a licensed pilot for about 15 months. He was certified to fly under visual flight rules, meaning he was able to use visual cues to guide him when weather conditions were favorable. However, he did not hold an instrument rating, meaning he was not proficient in using a plane's instruments to navigate through low visibility weather. No instrument rating. This is not a technicality. It is the difference between life and death on a hazy night over open water. A pilot without an instrument rating depends on his eyes, on being able to see the horizon, the shoreline, the lights on the ground. When those disappear, when the haze and the darkness erase the line between sky and sea, a pilot without instrument training has nothing left to orient himself. And there was more. In the days before the flight, JFK Jr. was recovering from a recent ankle injury and was wearing a brace, a detail that has prompted speculation about whether it affected his piloting ability. About 2 weeks before the crash, during another evening flight, his cast made it impossible for him to land the plane without the assistance of an instructor. Nevertheless, Kennedy declined the offer of an instructor to co-pilot on July 16th, saying that he wanted to do it alone. He wanted to do it alone. 2 weeks earlier, he couldn't land without help. On July 16th, he turned down the instructor. This is the man, 15 months licensed, no instrument rating, ankle just out of a cast, declining the offer of a co-pilot, to whom Ann Freeman had said her sentence. I told him never to take 2 of my girls up at the same time. She had said it, plainly. The instinct of a mother who did not need to understand aviation to understand risk, who simply knew, in the way mothers know, that you do not put 2 of your 3 daughters into one small plane, piloted by an inexperienced man. And on the evening of July 16, 1999, both of her daughters got on the plane. It happened almost by accident. the specific, ordinary way that catastrophe so often arrives. Lauren had invited John and Carolyn to lunch days earlier and encouraged Carolyn to come to the wedding. Lauren even offered to fly with them. She was to be dropped off at Martha's Vineyard. Lauren was not supposed to be a passenger on a doomed flight. She was catching a ride, a quick stop at the Vineyard, a favor between sisters. The last act of her life was helping her sister's marriage, going to the wedding, encouraging Carolyn to come, hitching a ride on the plane to her own weekend plans. The trio took off at 8:39 p.m., later than planned, and just 13 minutes after sunset, aboard Kennedy's Piper Saratoga. 13 minutes after sunset. Into a hazy night, over open water, with a pilot who could not navigate by instruments. Just over an hour later, their lives changed instantly and irreparably. Kennedy likely became disoriented while flying through thick fog near Martha's Vineyard, sending the plane into a steep, uncontrolled spiral into the Atlantic Ocean in about 30 seconds. 30 seconds. The plane spiraled into the Atlantic. Kennedy was 38, Carolyn 33, and Lauren 34 when they died. All had been wearing seatbelts and died on impact. And then began the 5 days. Carol Radziwill, the wife of Kennedy's cousin, was among the first to raise the alarm when they failed to arrive. She contacted the Coast Guard, setting off a 5-day search. 5 days. While the world watched, while the cameras assembled and the news anchors speculated, and the country held its breath for the Crown Prince of Camelot, Ann Freeman waited in Greenwich. She knew. She had warned him. And now she was waiting to find out whether the things she had feared, the things she had said out loud, the things she had specifically told him never to do, had taken both of her daughters. In the aftermath of the crash, Ann Freeman expressed anger and panic, recalling that she had warned Kennedy not to take 2 of her daughters up in a plane at the same time. Anger and panic. Not the composed, managed grief that the cameras wanted, not the dignified silence that the Kennedy machinery preferred. The raw, specific fury of a mother who had said the exact words, "Never take 2 of my girls up at the same time," and had been ignored, and was now watching the Atlantic Ocean refuse to give back her daughters. At 11:30 p.m. on July 20th, the salvage ship identified the plane's fuselage. Navy divers found parts of the plane 120 feet below the surface, approximately 7.5 miles west of Martha's Vineyard. On July 21st, divers found the bodies near the fuselage, still strapped in, both of her daughters. Carolyn, 33, Lauren, 34, recovered from the ocean floor, still strapped into their seats, in the same plane, exactly the way their mother had said she feared. The thing she warned him about happened. Exactly as she said it would. The bodies were recovered on July 21st, and almost immediately, before the grief had even settled, the machinery of the Kennedy family activated. Decisions began to be made about the funeral, the burial, the ashes. Decisions that, by the documented accounts of what happened in those days, did not place Ann Freeman and the Bessette family at the center of choices about their own daughters, what happened in the days after the bodies were found, and how a grieving mother found herself on the outside of decisions about her own children, is coming. Kennedys do not eulogize, non-Kennedys. The bodies were recovered on July 21st, 1999, and almost immediately, before the families had even begun to absorb what had happened, the question of what to do with the dead became a negotiation. It should not have been a negotiation. When a mother loses 2 daughters, the decisions about how to bury them belong to her. That is not a controversial proposition. It is the most basic dignity afforded to the grieving, the right to lay your own children to rest in the way you choose. But Ann Freeman was not burying ordinary daughters. She was burying a Kennedy wife and a Kennedy sister-in-law. And the Kennedy family had its own ideas. According to the oral biography by Liz McNeil and Rose Marie Terenzio, there were disagreements between the families about whether to bury or cremate. Initially, Ted Kennedy wanted his nephew to be buried in the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. The Kennedy plot. The family ground. The place where Kennedys are laid to rest. There was just one problem. Lauren couldn't be buried there since she wasn't a Kennedy family member, and the sister's mother, Ann Freeman, did not want her daughters separated. This is the heart of it. The Kennedy family was prepared to bury Carolyn, John's wife, in the Kennedy plot. But Lauren? Lauren was not a Kennedy. Lauren was just the sister who had offered to fly along, who had spent the last act of her life trying to help her sister's marriage, who had died strapped into a seat in the same plane. Lauren did not qualify for the Kennedy ground. And Ann Freeman, who had already lost both daughters, who had warned them not to fly together, who was living the exact nightmare she had tried to prevent, was now being told that her daughters might be separated in death, one in the Kennedy plot, one somewhere else. She said no. Anne wanted her daughters buried in Connecticut, together. She did not want them separated. She wanted her girls, her twins and the youngest, the three she had raised in Greenwich, the close-knit sisters who had been inseparable in life, to stay together in death. And so there was a meeting. A meeting was held about the funeral. Caroline Kennedy's husband, Ed Schlossberg, and Ted Kennedy's wife, Victoria Vicky Reggie, went to represent the Kennedy family. Think about that composition for a moment. On one side, a mother who had just lost 2 daughters. On the other side, the Kennedy family's representatives, sent to negotiate the terms of how those daughters would be remembered. And then there is the detail that, more than any other, reveals what the Bessette family was up against. It comes from the diary of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., John's cousin, as described in a recent biography. When Carolyn and Lauren's sister, Lisa Bessette, suggested that RFK Jr. should eulogize the couple together, since he had known them both very well, Ed Schlossberg shot down the idea, even though RFK Jr. had accepted to do it. According to RFK Jr.'s diary, Schlossberg told Lisa, "Kennedys do not eulogize non-Kennedys. Kennedys do not eulogize non-Kennedys." Read that again. Carolyn and Lauren Bessette were dead. They had died in a Kennedy plane, piloted by a Kennedy, on the way to a Kennedy wedding. And when their surviving sister suggested that a member of the Kennedy family who had loved them might speak at their farewell, the answer was, "Kennedys do not eulogize non-Kennedys." Lisa, disgusted by Schlossberg's reaction, asked him if he made up the rules on the spot and slammed down the phone. She slammed down the phone. Because what else do you do when you have lost both your sisters in a single night, and the family they married into and died alongside informs you that your sisters do not rate a eulogy from a Kennedy, that they are non-Kennedys, that the rules, the specific, invisible, ruthless rules of the institution, do not bend even for 2 dead women at the bottom of the Atlantic. Now, there was one Kennedy who came out of this, with his humanity intact. According to the biography, RFK Jr. was very sympathetic to Ann Freeman. As the author put it, one of the ways that Bobby does come out really well is that he's very sympathetic to Ann Freeman. She's just lost 2 daughters. She's just lost 2 daughters. It should not have required a special note of sympathy to recognize that. It should have been the obvious, central, organizing fact of every decision made in those days, that a mother had lost 2 of her 3 children, and that her wishes should come first. But in the machinery of the Kennedy family, it was not the central fact. It was a complication to be managed. Eventually, the families agreed. The ashes of all 3 were scattered into the waters off Martha's Vineyard on July 22, 1999, from the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Briscoe. 17 members of the Kennedy, Bessette, and Freeman families were present. Together, in the end, the sea took all 3, John, Carolyn, and Lauren, in the same water near the place they had died. And there is one detail from that day at sea that stays with you. Navy chaplain Barry C. Black, who carried the urns with John and Carolyn's ashes, said that despite having officiated over 100 funerals, he had not seen such palpable grief anywhere in my life. Black recalled a moment with Ann Freeman. He told her he had lost his own mother and shared his anger at God. Freeman didn't respond at the time, but later she returned to him and whispered, "What you said back there is the first thing that has made any sense since this whole horrible ordeal. The first thing that made any sense." That is where Ann Freeman was. A mother who had warned him, who had been right, who had lost both daughters exactly as she feared, who had then been told her dead girls were non-Kennedys, and who, standing on the deck of a Navy destroyer, scattering the ashes of 2 of her 3 children into the Atlantic, found that the only thing that made sense was a stranger's admission of rage at God. After the ashes were scattered, after the world's cameras turned away, and the Kennedy mythology absorbed another tragedy, and the story became, once again, about the Crown Prince of Camelot, Ann Freeman was left with a choice. She could disappear into her grief silently, the way the institution preferred, or she could do the one thing that would force an accounting, what Ann Freeman did next. And the settlement that the coverage reduced to a single sentence is coming. The one thing she could still do. After the ashes were scattered, Ann Freeman faced a choice. She could disappear into her grief, silently, privately, the way the institution preferred its complications to disappear. The Kennedy machinery had absorbed the tragedy. The mythology had its narrative, the Crown Prince of Camelot, lost too young, the curse continuing. There was no role in that narrative for a furious mother from Greenwich who had warned him, or she could do the one thing that would force an accounting. She filed a wrongful death claim. Carolyn and Lauren's mother, Ann Messina Freeman, filed claims for wrongful death and conscious pain and suffering against JFK Jr.'s estate. Understand what this took. To file this claim, Ann Freeman had to stand up, publicly, legally, formally, and assert that the beloved Crown Prince of Camelot, the most mourned man in America, the saluting boy grown into a national symbol, had killed her daughters through his negligence. She had to say it out loud, in a legal document, against a family with limitless resources and the full weight of American sentiment behind it. And the facts were on her side. Almost immediately, the cause of the crash was attributed to Kennedy, who had been piloting the plane in haze and darkness, even though he was only certified to fly under visual flight rules. In 2000, the National Transportation Safety Board confirmed this assessment, concluding that Kennedy had become spatially disoriented and had failed to maintain control during a descent over water at night. Pilot error. The official finding. Not mechanical failure, not weather beyond anyone's control, not bad luck. A pilot who was not qualified for the conditions, who declined a co-pilot, who took 2 of Ann Freeman's daughters into a hazy night sky over open water, exactly as she had warned him not to. As one attorney explained, her sister could have a cause of action for negligent operation of the aircraft. Given the current state of facts, it certainly would seem that a case can be made out for negligence in the operation of the aircraft. She had a case, and she pursued it. Negotiations between the 2 families began about 18 months after the crash. The Kennedys reportedly offered $7 million, while the Bessettes were asking for at least $20 million. The negotiation itself tells you something. $7 million, the Kennedys offered. $20 million, the Bessettes asked. 2 daughters, an investment banker at the height of her career, and a fashion icon, reduced to a number that 2 sets of lawyers haggled over for 18 months. This is what the legal system offers the grieving. Not justice, not acknowledgement, but a dollar figure negotiated in conference rooms, while the actual loss, 2 women, gone forever, sits outside the math entirely. In July 2001, Manhattan surrogate judge Renee Roth approved Ann's request to compromise and settle the cause of action tied to her daughters' deaths. As part of the agreement, the estate was cleared of any further lawsuits and claims once the settlement was finalized. It was settled in July 2001. Now, here is a detail that this video wants to be precise about, because precision matters, and this channel does not invent. The famous figure, $15 million, that has appeared in coverage of this case for over 2 decades is not confirmed. At one point, a New York Post report suggested the payout could have been around $15 million, but Ann's attorney, Constantine Raleigh, told CNN that was false. "I don't know where they got that number," Raleigh said. "The exact terms were never made public. The exact terms were never made public." The settlement was real. The acknowledgement of negligence, implicit in the estate paying anything at all, was real. But the specific amount that the world has repeated for 25 years is, by the account of Ann Freeman's own lawyer, not confirmed. And that matters, because it points to the deeper truth of what the settlement actually was. It was never really about the money. A settlement is the legal system's way of saying someone was responsible. When the estate of John F. Kennedy Jr. paid Ann Freeman to settle a wrongful death claim, it was, in the only language the institution understood, an admission, an acknowledgement that the deaths of Carolyn and Lauren Bessette were not simply fate, not simply the Kennedy curse, not simply tragedy, that they were the result of a choice. A choice to fly that night, a choice to decline the co-pilot, a choice to take 2 sisters into the same plane. The exact choice Ann Freeman had warned against. The settlement was the closest thing to justice the system could offer her, not her daughter's back, not even a public apology, just a formal, legal, private acknowledgement that she had been wronged. And then she went silent. In the months that followed, Ann largely stayed out of the limelight to mourn privately. A year later, those close to Ann said she was still having difficulty keeping control of a life that had spiraled wildly into the public domain. A life that spiraled into the public domain. That is what the Kennedy connection had done to her. A school administrator from White Plains, a private woman who had built an ordinary life, was now permanently attached to the most famous tragedy of the decade. Her grief a matter of public record, her daughter's deaths replayed endlessly, her own name reduced to a footnote in the Camelot mythology. She had warned him. She had been right. She had lost both daughters. She had been told they were non-Kennedys. She had fought for and won the only acknowledgement the system could give. And now she was supposed to simply live with it. And there was one more person living with it too. Lisa Bessette, Lauren's twin, became the sole surviving Bessette sister. On the day of the crash, she not only lost Carolyn, her younger sister, she also lost her twin sister Lauren. Lisa lost her twin. There is a specific, particular devastation in losing a twin, the person who was there before you were born, who shared the womb, who is in some sense the other half of your own existence. Lisa Bessette lost Lauren and Carolyn in the same night. Lisa pursued academics, earned a PhD in art history, and has lived a far more private life, largely staying out of the public eye since the tragedy. She is older now than either of her sisters ever got to be. She's had 20 years of birthdays without her twin, older than her sisters ever got to be. Birthdays without her twin. The 2 survivors of the Bessette family, the mother and the remaining daughter, chose the same thing. Silence. Privacy. The specific, dignified refusal to turn their grief into spectacle, even as the world turned the deaths of Carolyn and Lauren into endless content. Ann Freeman lived 8 more years after the settlement. 8 years carrying the loss of 2 daughters, the knowledge that she had warned him, the specific weight of a grief that the world would never let her process privately. How those final years passed, when she died, and the question this video has been building toward from the very first frame, what the institution owed Ann Freeman, and whether it ever truly paid, is coming. The 8 years nobody saw. Ann Freeman lived 8 more years after the settlement, and almost nothing is known about them. This is, in itself, the most telling fact about the final chapter of her life. The world that had consumed every detail of her daughter's marriage, that had replayed the crash endlessly, that had turned Carolyn Bessette into an icon and the tragedy into mythology. That world had no interest in what happened to the mother afterward. In the wake of Carolyn, Lauren, and John's deaths, Anne grieved privately. She never spoke publicly about the tragedy. Never. Not once. In the 8 years between the settlement and her death, Ann Freeman did not give an interview. She did not write a memoir. She did not appear on television to share her grief, or correct the record, or claim the spotlight that her connection to the most famous family in America would have made available to her at any moment. She said nothing. She had said her piece already, in the only forum that mattered, the wrongful death claim, the formal acknowledgement that her daughter's deaths were not simply fate. And then she went silent, and stayed silent, for the rest of her life. The few details that survive are sparse, and in the way of this story, contested. She had remarried for love. She met Dr. Richard Freeman, the orthopedic surgeon, when Carolyn needed treatment for scoliosis as a child. Richard was a recent widower with 3 children of his own. They married in 1977. He had been her partner through the building of the family, through the raising of the daughters, and now through the unimaginable loss of 2 of them. She had worked, even after everything. She had been a substitute teacher at Juniper Hill Elementary School, the same school Carolyn had attended as a girl. An educator to the end, a woman whose life's work was children, who had lost 2 of her own. And one source that knew her described those final years in the plainest possible terms. She struggled to cope with the grief of her 2 young daughters and son-in-law's deaths. She lived a broken life for the last years of her life. A broken life, that is the phrase. Not a public life, not a tragic, glamorous life, not a life that the cameras followed. A broken life, lived privately, in Connecticut, away from the spotlight, carrying a weight that no settlement, and no acknowledgement, and no amount of time could lift. On April 24, 2007, Ann Messina Freeman died. She was 67 years old. And here is the final, strange detail, the one that captures exactly how little the world cared about the mother at the center of this story. Very little public information has ever been shared about the cause or the circumstances of her death. The woman whose daughter's every move had been documented for years, whose son-in-law's death had been one of the biggest news stories of the decade, died, and almost no one recorded how. There is so little confirmed information that even now, the records conflict. Multiple reputable sources report that Ann Messina Freeman died on April 24, 2007, at the age of 67, and yet there remain scattered, unverified claims in corners of the internet suggesting she might still be living privately somewhere in Connecticut. The weight of the evidence, the obituaries, the reporting, the genealogical records, supports that she died in 2007. But the very existence of the confusion tells you everything. This is a woman whose death was so quiet, so unremarked, so completely outside the machinery that had consumed her family, that the basic fact of when she died is not entirely settled in the public record. The mother who warned him, the mother who was right, the mother who lost both daughters in a single night, the mother who was told her dead girls were non-Kennedys, the mother who fought for and won the only acknowledgement the system could give. She died, quietly, privately, in a grief the world never bothered to follow, and the world barely noticed. Now, this is the moment to name the pattern this video has been tracing from the first frame. This channel has told this story before, in different forms. A woman stands at the edge of a powerful institution, the Crown, the studio system, the music industry, the Kennedy dynasty. The institution takes what it needs from her or from someone she loves, and when the cost comes due, the institution does not pay it. It manages it. It moves on, and the woman is left holding a grief the institution helped create and refuses to fully acknowledge. Ann Freeman is the purest version of this pattern. She was never famous. She never wanted to be. She was a school administrator from White Plains, who raised 3 remarkable daughters and warned the most powerful young man in America not to do the one thing that would destroy her family. He did it anyway, and the institution that he belonged to, the Kennedy Mythology, the closest thing America has to a royal family, absorbed the deaths of her daughters into its own legend. The crash became another chapter in the Kennedy curse. The crown prince was mourned, the mythology grew, and the two women who actually died, Carolyn and Lauren Bessette, became supporting characters in someone else's story. The wife, the sister-in-law, the non-Kennedys, while their mother grieved in silence, 8 years, a broken life, until she died so quietly the date is barely recorded. There is one question this video has not yet asked directly. Not about the crash, not about the settlement, not about the silence. The question about what Ann Freeman actually deserved, from the family her daughters married into, from the institution that absorbed their deaths, from a world that turned her daughters into icons and forgot the woman who raised them, and what the honest accounting of that looks like, is coming. Let me tell you what this video has actually been about. It has not been about a plane crash. The plane crash is where every other telling of this story begins and ends. The foggy night, the inexperienced pilot, the spiral into the Atlantic, the 5-day search, the Crown Prince of Camelot lost too young. That is the story the world has told for 25 years. That is not the story this video told. This video was about a sentence. I told him never to take 2 of my girls up at the same time. A mother said that. Before any of it happened. Before the crash and the search and the settlement and the silence. A mother looked at the most famous young man in America. A man with 15 months of flying experience, no instrument rating, an ankle just out of a cast, declining the offer of a co-pilot, and she said the one thing that, if he had listened, would have saved at least one of her daughters. He didn't listen, and she lost both, exactly the way she said she feared. This video has been about what happens to the people the mythology leaves behind. Because the Kennedy story has a shape, and we all know the shape. The handsome prince, the beautiful bride, the tragic, glamorous end, the curse that follows the family across generations. It is one of the most powerful stories America has ever told itself, and the death of John F. Kennedy Jr. fit it perfectly, too perfectly. He became, in death, exactly what the mythology needed him to be. But there was a mother in Greenwich, Connecticut, who did not get to be part of that beautiful, terrible story. She got to be the footnote, the Carolyn and Lauren's mother, the woman who appears in the coverage of the crash for one sentence about a settlement before the cameras turn back to the Kennedys. And here is what that mother actually was. She was a school administrator, a working woman who spent her life in the public schools, educating other people's children. She raised 3 daughters, twins and the youngest, through a divorce and a remarriage, and the specific, daily, unglamorous work of holding a family together. She built 3 remarkable women, an investment banker, a scholar, a fashion icon, all of them close, all of them devoted to each other. And she was right. That is the part this video most wants you to sit with. She was right about everything. She was right at the wedding rehearsal dinner, when she stood up and said, in front of everyone, to the visible sting of the groom, that she was worried for her daughter, unsure if this union was in her best interest. The world thought she was being cold. She was being a mother who could see the machine her daughter was walking into. She was right about the microscope, about what the spotlight would do to her private, sensitive daughter. Carolyn was hounded, isolated, demoralized, exactly as Anne feared. And she was right about the plane. Never take 2 of my girls up at the same time. She said it. She said it plainly. She said it to the one person who could have honored it. And he didn't. What did the institution owe Ann Freeman? It owed her, at minimum, the dignity of being heard. When her surviving daughter Lisa suggested that a Kennedy who loved Carolyn and Lauren might speak at their farewell, the institution's answer was, Kennedys do not eulogize non-Kennedys. That is what it thought her daughters were worth. Non-Kennedys. A category. A complication. It owed her the acknowledgement that her daughters were not supporting characters in someone else's tragedy. That Carolyn and Lauren Bessette were whole people, with their own lives and careers and futures, who died because of a choice that a mother had specifically warned against. It owed her, frankly, an apology. She never got one. What she got was a settlement, negotiated over 18 months, the Kennedys offering $7 million, the Bessettes asking 20, the lawyers haggling over the price of 2 daughters, while the actual loss sat outside the math. And even that, the closest thing to justice the system could produce, the world reduced to a disputed number and a single sentence. And then she went home to Greenwich and lived a broken life for 8 years, and died so quietly that the record of her death is barely complete. That is what the institution owed her, and that is what it paid. Nothing that mattered. Now, I want to leave you with 2 things before you go. The first is the detail that, for me, holds this entire story. On the deck of a Navy destroyer, scattering the ashes of 2 of her 3 children into the Atlantic, Ann Freeman was approached by a chaplain who had officiated more than 100 funerals and said he had never seen grief so palpable in his life. He told her he had lost his own mother. He told her about his anger at God. And later, not in the moment, but later, Ann Freeman returned to him and whispered, "What you said back there is the first thing that has made any sense since this whole horrible ordeal. The first thing that made sense. Not the mythology, not the curse, not the crown prince, not the beautiful tragic story the world was already telling. A stranger's honest admission of rage at God. That is where the institution left Ann Freeman. The second is a question. 2 questions, actually. The first, Ann Freeman warned him. She said the exact words. If John F. Kennedy Jr. had simply listened to his mother-in-law, if he had taken only one of her daughters, or none of them, on that plane, how different would all of it have been? How much of this tragedy was fate, and how much was a warning that a powerful young man felt entitled to ignore? Tell me what you think. And the second, we remember the Bessette sisters as the wife and the sister-in-law, Carolyn the icon, Lauren the footnote. We remember them in relation to the Kennedys. But they were Ann Freeman's daughters first, raised in Greenwich, in a close Catholic family, by a school administrator who loved them. If the mythology had never touched them, if Carolyn had never married a Kennedy, would the world have let them be who they actually were? Leave me your answer below. I read every single one. If this video said something about Ann Freeman, the mother the mythology forgot, that the coverage of this tragedy never said, "Please share it," because the world remembers the Crown Prince. This video was about the woman who warned him and lost everything when he didn't listen. Her name was Ann Freeman. She was right, and nobody listened until it was too late. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here. Thank you.